my dears, welcome. Today's video is going to be about learning to develop distress tolerance solely for the purpose of learning how to safely and comfortably stand up for yourself in situations, and has absolutely no and zero political undertones at all whatsoever. I mean, like, how you choose to use this skill set is ultimately up to you, but I definitely, as a channel that focuses on disability and critical thinking, would never dare teach you skills that could be used for civil disobedience, to be abundantly clear. Before we dive in, for friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown, shoulder-length curly hair. I'm wearing a black t-shirt with a green jacket on top because my apartment is freezing, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. I have some I don't think disclaimers is the right word, perhaps context is the better choice here, before we begin. I was inspired to make this video after seeing a directly post-inauguration post from Dr. Devon Price about how to be more disobedient and how to build distress tolerance primarily to fight back against big systems that oppress us, which also connected to an article he had written in 2023 that I found really interesting. I often find Dr. Devon Price's work to tend to lean a little bit more on the radical side than I'd tend to stand, and he will often make sweeping generalizations about all autistic people that can often exclude folks with medium to high support needs, and this article in particular was geared a little bit more in the direction of here's how to shoplift because anarchy is great, rather than like more on self-advocacy and conflict tolerance aspects of the conversation, where I personally think there's more to expand on and learn from. So I wanted to turn that into a video and sort of add some tips and tricks that I've learned over time about boundaries and conflict and distress tolerance. And I will also, of course, link everything of his that covers this topic and my other sources as well below for you if you want to check those out. Two things I want to talk about briefly about that are sort of on the way to that concept, in the vein of autism and self-advocacy, are the pervasive idea of autistics being more inherently social justice oriented and of autistics being unable to lie. Both are obviously vast generalizations, and they both rest on the assumption that autistics are pure and innocent and morally perfect. This assumption is part of what is called Aspie supremacy, which is basically the idea that autistics are better than non-autistics. They are morally superior to non-autistics, and it usually contains a lot of internalized ableism toward higher support needs autistics, and it's generally kind of eugenicist and gross, and I'm not a fan of it. This particular pure and innocent mindset also infantilizes autistics and dehumanizes us to some degree, as well as create massive cognitive biases that say that autistics cannot cause harm, which is just fundamentally untrue. I have a video about accidental harm with a central focus on incel culture from a few years ago. I will link above if you want to learn more about this topic. But basically, it's unfair to say that autistics can't cause harm because, first of all, it lets people get away with significant harm, which is never okay, but also a huge part of being a human person is just messing up and having to fix things and having to apologize for things. And so the assumption that autistics can't do that kind of implies that we are not, in fact, humans. The autistics are wired for social justice situation came from a string of studies about autism and a couple about ADHD and justice sensitivity. The idea that autistics and ADHDers are likely to have higher levels of justice sensitivity, which is a sensitivity to fairness and equity and a need to speak out when things they feel that something is wrong. The first study that I was able to find about this is from 2016, though there have been studies on autism and moral judgment for quite some time. Most of the studies that people point to around autism and justice sensitivity are from the last 5 years or so, which has then been used often by online activists, primarily Aspie supremacist ones, to talk about how autistics and ADHDers are wired for non-compliance, how we are inherently more social justice oriented and likely to fight for what is right. And that's just not an accurate analysis of the data at hand. These studies on morality typically focus on the perceived morality of the participant. Whether that actually matches that of what is typically considered to be morality or not is a very different conversation. Morality itself is also super subjective more generally, and so the key information we can actually gain from these studies is not that autistics and ADHDers are wired for social justice and non-compliance, but that autistics and ADHDers tend to have strong and strict opinions on what is right and wrong and are more likely to work to make things around them align with those rules. Can this translate to a strong need for a social justice situation like Greta Thunberg and climate change? Absolutely, but it can also just as easily translate into right-wing language about how minority people are taking away opportunities from everybody else. The actual key information, at least for me, is the rigidity of thinking and how inherently powerful that is in whichever direction it may point. Also, to link back to the autistics can't lie stereotype, that is also obviously not true. We might be bad at lying in that people can tell from our facial expressions when that is happening. We might be morally against or not see the logic in lying and have strict rules on how we want to behave, so we don't do that, but that does not mean that autistics cannot lie. First of all, because autistics have free will and are human people who can do what they want, so sometimes that is a deliberate choice. And second of all, because unreliable speech and tonal differences can also cause a lot of lying. Unreliable speech is when things you don't mean or that aren't entirely true just kind of fall out of your mouth and you don't know how that happened, and then you try to cover for it because you're not sure why you lied in the first place. Like if somebody's like, oh, I really like your skirt, did you make it? And you just say yes for some reason, even though that is not true, but then it leads to a whole conversation around sewing things that you did not sew. This situation can also happen with tonal differences, like when you make a joke or say something sarcastic, but somebody else doesn't realize that it's a joke and takes it at face value, and then you don't know how to backtrack out of that. The most important piece of the lying conversation, though, is acknowledging that lying in and of itself is not actually a moral failing, and the vast majority of the time it happens in situations where people don't feel that honesty is safe, and thus lying is the only option. If you know that saying something is overwhelming, is going to get you in trouble, you say that it's fine. If you know that somebody is going to call you rude or unintelligent for saying something doesn't make sense or is illogical, you're probably going to act like it is logical, even if you know deep down that it isn't. If somebody you want to or need to impress for some reason asks you if you like something, you're probably going to lie and say that you do, even if you don't know what that thing is, or if you actually think that it's garbage. It's very common for autistics and also for other people to have to learn how to lie in order to stay safe. All of that was slightly tangential to the topic of disobedience and distress tolerance, but as we're talking about autism and social justice to some degree, and I saw elements of the moral superiority discourse come up in Dr. Devon Price's articles on the topic, I wanted to make sure that I addressed that. And I do think the lying piece in particular connects directly to trauma and autistic masking, which can often create low distress tolerance in people. Now, masking is a complicated concept in the world of autistic advocacy because there are lots of arguments from some folks about how being able to mask is a privilege because it can make it easier for a person to pass and get by in the world, where other folks argue that not having to mask is a privilege because masking is exhausting, it diminishes your supports, and it diminishes your boundaries and sense of self. And because high masking is often equated with low support needs, which is not always true or accurate and is kind of a dangerous comparison, and because many autism self-advocacy resources are primarily for high masking and low support needs populations, but then make big sweeping generalizations about their experience and understanding of autism being the universal autistic experience, it's simply just not how that works. I also find that a lot of resources specifically relating to high masking and low support needs autistics can be very helpful for non-autistic people, particularly people with complex PTSD. So I'm never the hugest fan in general of the like autistic experience, this thing framing. All of which to say, I'm going to try to avoid that where possible here, but I also want to make sure that that framing is clear so that we don't slip into any biases of who this information might be for, if that makes any sense. But when we talk about the trauma of masking, the thing in particular I wanted to talk about here is social chameleoning and people pleasing, where as a survival mechanism, a person can become super fluid so they fit in everywhere and are universally liked at best, or at least just not perceived at all. For many people, growing up different, we're so used to being rejected by people for who we are, or told that we are always doing things wrong or messing things up, or overall just getting primarily negative attention from our surroundings. And so we find that a way to minimize that harm from people while still being able to interact with them is to just completely fit in so that we will not be perceived, so then we cannot get hurt. A common trauma response talked about here is fawning, which is functionally responding to a perceived threat by people pleasing, by over-sacrificing yourself for other people and submitting to what they want or what you think they want in order to try to stay safe. And when all or most people feel like a threat to you, fawning and masking becomes the default at the cost of ourselves and our beliefs and our boundaries and our safety and everything else. And it can be incredibly hard to break out of, particularly because of how quickly you lose your sense of self, so that you don't know where your touchstones are to help you break out of that. But also because in situations where this is actively being used against you, autistics are so used to being told our experiences and understandings of situations are wrong that if what we understand of our experience is actively contradicted, we immediately assume that it must be that we missed a social cue or might just not understand. I also have found that a lot of autistics, including myself, will struggle in situations where harm is actively being caused to not be like, well, I get misunderstood a lot, so the person hurting me must just not have it explained right to them, or just might not get it, and sort of defend that harmful behavior. And in that vein, if you are struggling with stuff like that, I have a video about gaslighting that I will link above that you should check out, because to be clear, if somebody's making you feel like that, you should not keep them around. You deserve better than that. Don't put yourself in those situations. They're dangerous and bad, and don't do that. Now, a huge part of this fawning and people pleasing can be obsessive rule following. There's this autism stereotype you primarily see in like early 2000s autistic media representation where the character is so arbitrarily obsessed with rules and it's framed as being like fundamentally illogical and is used as the primary conflict in the narrative. But really much of the autistic obsession with rule following is that so little the world has guidelines on how to behave and how to fit in and how to not get in trouble and how things work. But when somebody presents you with a list of rules, that's something to explain to you how things work and how you should behave. And so I can just study and absorb that, and then I will be safe, right? That's how that works. It's also a way that we can make sense of the world and understand it. If I have to follow the rules, then so do the others. This is how things are organized, and this is how they are less overwhelming, which means that when, say, somebody cuts the line on the playground to the slide, it feels incredibly overwhelming and confusing. And so you end up yelling at the kid to follow the rules, and then suddenly you're not cool. In school dynamics in particular, you sort of know that your teacher will like you if you follow those rules, so it's an easy way to get by and ensure at least one good relationship at school, even when the rest are confusing and scary. And since we spend so much time in school, that becomes a habit outside of school as well. And over time, this can become such an ingrained feeling of, if I follow the rules, I will be safe and things will make sense, that breaking those rules can feel daunting, if not terrifying. I know that the first time I had to ask for an extension on a paper, even though I knew I was allowed to get an extension, I had accommodations, I felt physically ill knowing that I would not be meeting the original due date. I felt like I was wrong or I was bad, even though I knew that I wasn't going to get in trouble for it. There was a time in high school where we had to wear the nicer uniform on Fridays, and I forgot it was a Friday, so I wore the wrong color shoes, and I was panicked all day that I was going to get yelled at, but then nobody noticed at all, and also most other people were also out of uniform. I also used to, I still feel this way, like incredibly just wrong taking a day off of school or work or having to leave something before it's over because I feel like I've broken a rule, even though really nobody cares about that. But I try to remind myself that like, I'm not going to get in trouble. Nobody cares. Nobody is perfect all the time. People are late sometimes or awkward sometimes or forget about the rules. And even if it were a situation where I were to get in trouble, it may feel icky the moment it happens, but that icky feeling will pass and people will forget about it pretty quickly, so it really doesn't need to ruin my day. And unpacking all of this can obviously be really helpful for a number of reasons. The most important one being learning how to find and keep track of your needs and moral compass and what boundaries you need to put in place to protect and be true to those things. Learning how to feel comfortable standing up for what you need and generally exercising agency is incredibly important, not just because like conformity is boring and you deserve to be every single color of who you are, but also because not having firm boundaries or parameters for who you are and what you need, and also feeling afraid to stand up for those things, can make it really easy for people to take advantage of you and put you in active harm's way. But also at the same time, to create situations where you don't find resentment building up because you've overextended yourself to please other people to make yourself feel safer, you know? And so the first and most important thing to work through here is evaluating the concept of safety and what that means for you and where you sort of set boundaries around that. Because something feeling unsafe does not inherently mean that you are in active danger, and it's important to start to figure out where that line is and what that line feels like. An example I use a lot in educational and performance spaces is the concept of comfort zone, stretch zone, and danger zone. The stretch zone is where you're able to be a little bit uncomfortable, you're able to do most of your learning and growing, but you can also go back to the comfort zone to rest and recharge before jumping into the stretch zone again. If it ever gets to the danger zone, that's a point where you're no longer able to learn, you're so far out of your comfort zone as to just be unhealthy and genuinely unsafe, and once the danger zone has been hit, you cannot go back to the stretch zone for some time. You need to go back to the comfort zone to reset a little bit before you're able to stretch again. There's another version of this that uses a stoplight as an analogy, like the red light, green light, yellow light. I personally prefer comfort, stretch, danger because it gives more language to the specific experience of it than just like colors, but if that works better for you, please take what helps. I often see this thing shared around the autistic community where people like joke about how they're told to trust their gut feelings, but their gut feelings see the stress of sending an email or having a conversation as equivalent to the stress of getting chased down the street or of somebody putting them in active danger, so they feel that they need to ignore their gut feelings. And when I first saw that years ago, I really resonated with it, but I've been working a lot on learning to feel my feelings and allowing myself to feel uncomfortable and anxious, and I've started to find that there's a lot of specific shades and nuances to the pressure or feeling or anxiety around each one of these things that are fundamentally different and should be managed and paid attention to differently. I've sort of found a way to be like, hey, maybe the level of panic I'm feeling about this thing right now doesn't equate to the level of stakes for the situation at hand, but I'm going to let it sit on my body for a moment to acknowledge that the feeling came from somewhere, that I'm not in active danger, and it will do something to regulate myself so I can complete this task, rather than just going, Sydney, it's just an email. Why are you so anxious? Ignore what you're feeling, shove it in a box, and do the thing like a normal person. Also, side note, if you're really nervous about emails, highly recommend writing them in a notes app or whatever, and then sending them the next day, so the sending and the writing feel like two separate tasks. It cuts down on a feeling of urgency and also gives you a chance to read through everything a second time when you're in a clearer mind. Pro tips. But by approaching my big feelings in a more acknowledging and affirming way, I've been able to figure out different ways to regulate my nervousness that aren't just trying to talk myself out of it, which has given me a better toolbox to be able to do things while scared, which has in turn lessened my anxiety around certain things that used to be super activating, but are now just day-to-day experiences that I don't even notice make me nervous anymore. And notice that this is different than just brute forcing through an icky feeling. It's acknowledging it and working with it while also doing the thing that I want to do or the thing that needs to get done in a way way that is affirming of my potential access needs. The objective is not to desensitize to something, but rather to acknowledge what's happening, take in the data as information, and then work with and work through it. A lot of the I can't understand my gut feelings worldview comes from a lot of training, sometimes through therapy, but also just through how the world treats people, that our feelings are wrong or that we're too sensitive, which leads to the shoving down, intellectualizing, and ignoring of feelings. Combine this with alexithymia, which is the difficulty to identify and understand the emotions you might be feeling, which is incredibly common in neurodivergent folks, especially autistics, and various interoception issues that can make it difficult to fully sense and manage internal bodily signals. It becomes very easy for all feelings to become very overwhelming and confusing. And at least for me, growing up in cognitive behavioral therapy, I was told that ways to manage that was to just learn to explain them away. So I just stopped feeling my feelings in a way that from the outside was considered to be getting in the way of my day-to-day functioning, rather than how to work with them in order to move forward, which instead taught me to ignore all my feelings altogether and talk myself out of a lot of the more negative ones, rather than ask where those came from and say that negative emotions are inherently bad and work with what my body was trying to tell me rather than working against it. There are also things that we obviously cannot and should not build stress tolerance for, like sensory needs, for example. If I can't do the texture of a food, continuously forcing myself to eat that, it's not going to actually make the texture of it any more tolerable for me. It's just going to be overwhelming. Going to an overwhelmingly loud concert once a week, not going to make me any less sensitive to loud noise. It's just going to be tiring. The other thing that we obviously cannot and should not build stress tolerance for is any abusive or otherwise dangerous behavior. If somebody is telling you that you need to get used to them yelling at you or putting you down constantly because you're too sensitive, they're wrong and you don't deserve to be treated that way. In case you're not aware, being anxious around somebody verbally beating you is a very reasonable and rational response that is there to keep you safe and is there for a purpose, and so you should probably listen to it and keep that guard up all the time. So when we're picking what kinds of distress and big feelings we want to learn how to sit with and how to work through, these kinds of things are just not going to be ever on the table because our bodies are telling us that they're making us viscerally uncomfortable or unsafe for a reason that we kind of need to be listening to. So when I'm talking about doing things that feel slightly unsafe here, I'm very much referring to things that don't actually jeopardize your safety to a major degree, to be abundantly clear. But like we talked about earlier, fawning and people-pleasing as a trauma response is something that we could definitely build up a tolerance for. One big thing for me is realizing that like other people being angry or sad or otherwise feeling a negative emotion around me does not mean the said emotion is my fault, that they're going to then take it out on me, or that I need to fix it to make me feel better. I am safe and I can just sit through it with them, and that's all that I need to do. And if they're going to take that emotion out on me or make me feel unsafe, I'll remove myself from that situation, and that does not make me a bad friend or a bad person. I also might clock that if this is a consistent issue, I might say, hey, maybe this isn't a person that I want in my life anymore, or a type of behavior that I want to have in my life anymore, and I might do something about that. But either way, it's not my job to fix it. Another great thing to practice is just saying no to stuff. You can start with really small things like, I don't want an extra serving of dinner, thank you, or it's my only night off this week, I'd love to hang out with you, but just another time. You can say no to larger things, like when somebody asks you to cover somebody else's shift and you don't really want to, or if your best friend needs your help because they're panicking about something but you don't have the emotional energy to be able to support them properly. And you also don't owe anybody an explanation beyond the word no either. I mean, like, sometimes it's the right thing to do and you probably should. Like for the friend example, I might be like, hey, I really don't have the spoons to support you properly right now. Do you have somebody else that you could call, or is this an emergency? And usually they do have somebody else that they can talk to, and it's all good. And they're also not mad at me when that happens. And then they feel like they can set a boundary with me as well. And it's great, and it makes our relationship a lot more healthy. And obviously when I have more energy down the line, I can follow up another time and say, hey, what was that? Do you still want to talk through it? Is everything good? For the shift at work example, you can say, I can't. That's enough. You don't need to say why you don't want an extra serving of dinner. You could be full. You also could think the dinner is disgusting. All of those things can be inside thoughts. No is a complete sentence and you are allowed to say it. You also don't have to volunteer for things that you happen to know how to do. A huge thing in theater is the like all hands on deck mentality, and sometimes I'll be in a room and they'll be like, oh, we need to look for a photographer. And I'll think to myself, oh, well, I'm a photographer. I should do that. And then I realize that I don't want to put an extra thing on my plate, and also they're probably not gonna have a hard time finding a photographer, so maybe I should just keep that information to myself so that I don't have to take on more work. And that was a thrilling realization to have. Genuinely life-changing. Other things that you can start with are not instinctively switching screens and hiding or stopping what you're watching when somebody else enters a room. Even if you know that person might tease you for what you're watching, or if it's a show that they really dislike, that's okay. You can still keep watching it and take up that space without needing to apologize or feel self-conscious. I mean, maybe put on headphones because they might be trying to focus on something else in that space. That might be the nice thing to do, but you don't need to stop watching it or be embarrassed about what you're watching. And yeah, you're probably going to feel self-conscious the first couple times, 100%. But rather than alleviating that feeling immediately, sit through that feeling and try to enjoy your show anyway. And before you know it, you're not even going to notice that nervousness anymore. Another one that I would recommend is eating the snack somebody always teases you because they think it's gross. My roommate absolutely hates peanut butter, which made me really weirdly anxious about having it around the house. So I stopped eating it for a few months, and then I realized that was super unnecessary and weird of me to have made that choice. And I love peanut butter, and also she never comments on me eating it anyway. I just created my own anxiety block, so I just started eating it again, and it literally didn't matter and nobody cared. There's also deliberate autistic unmasking, like reacting naturally to the way you feel about something, or letting yourself only stim and using stim toys. I know that was something I really struggled with getting comfortable around doing, but once I started, I found that I was consistently just way less exhausted all the time. It's important to start small with things that may lightly disappoint others, but meet your needs or meet what you really want to do. For another example, I used to get really nervous going out to do things on my own and would often try to wait for when somebody else could come with me to go do those things. But I really wanted to go to the zoo last spring, and I have weird days off that none of my friends have as days off, and so I just went by myself. And it was really scary, but I also had like the best day ever, and now I don't even think about solo adventures as a daunting concept anymore. One of the examples Dr. Devin Price gave was wearing something more revealing that, you know, your mom might roll her eyes at you for, but you know makes you feel confident and fantastic. He says, it's okay if you feel like a beacon of sin, just keep it moving. Your emotions are not the target here, your behavior is. You can feel however you are feeling in the moment, so long as you keep acting like you're free. And over time, you're gonna get used to it, and it's not really gonna bother you anymore. You can also do weird things on purpose to learn that it's not the end of the world. Like the time that my friend and I went running screaming down the mostly empty Coney Island boardwalk, and it was fantastic. We didn't care who saw us because there were maybe 4 people there. Or like getting weird things at the store is a great example. I shop at Trader Joe's for most of the things that I need, but there are specific brands for stuff that I know are Sydney allergen friendly because I can't eat a lot of things. So I go to the more expensive grocery store that's near me. It's like across the street to pick them up, which means half the time at checkout, I'm getting a pile of what is functionally toddler food. It's like Danimals yogurts and pasta sauce and mac and cheese and chicken nuggets. And it took me a really long time to not feel embarrassed or weird for getting those things. But nobody's paying attention to your cart to begin with anyway, or those people are never going to see you again also. And also just like walk into a store and walk out without buying anything. That's also a really great distress tolerance thing to work on. Have a deliberately slightly weird social interaction with somebody and realize that it doesn't matter that much. Dress weird in public. Whenever I stare at somebody for dressing strange, it's usually because I'm admiring it and sort of taking mental notes on how to style something similar if I feel that I could pull off a version of that. I'm never like, ew, how dare they dress that way? I'm like, ooh, choices. I love choices. Most people are that way. Do things that make you perceived in a safe way to learn that being perceived isn't actually terrifying all the time, and it can in fact be wonderful. Another great way to work on these skills is to practice playing mean or generally assertive characters in video games or on stage or in TTRPGs. It makes way more of a difference than you would ever think. I did a play in my first year of college where I played a girl who was such a bossy know-it-all and I wanted to punch her, and she like started fights in every single direction all the time. But the level of lifelong confidence that I gained from playing that character is something I will forever be grateful for. I also want to be super clear that these things can be wildly uneven. Like, I get kind of anxious about all the things I'm talking about here, some of which to a point where I actively still try to avoid them. But at the same time, I can handle the negative feelings that come from doing activist work where I'm standing up to like head administrators in hostile situations where I'm pointing out major issues with a system or structure. I personally found that a lot of my struggles with being perceived and with conflict and with confrontation go away when I have to fight for other people, but I really cannot do that when it comes to myself. So that's like a particular muscle that I'm working on, partially through fighting for other people and remembering what that feels like and using that tolerance across for my needs as well. So this is very much a skill that while I'm giving advice on it, I too am, to be clear, actively working on. I know you probably wouldn't believe it by the fact that my job is social media and also I'm a theater performer, but I just get so viscerally uncomfortable being perceived to any degree, and it's just a whole thing. Anyway, another thing to work through once you have a bit of a base level for distress tolerance is starting to question the rule book. Why are those the rules? Who's enforcing them? What happens if they're not followed? Where did this rule come from? Is this rule in line with my values? For an example from Dr. Devin Price, he knows that he as a teacher is not allowed to accept any late work, but he knows that his students are primarily minority folks for whom school is not their first or second priority. And he also knows that nobody in the administration is really paying attention to that, and so he probably won't get in that much trouble. So he accepts late work anyway because he feels that it is not impeding their learning and is the ethical thing to do. There are lots of places that have a no eating or drinking rule, but for somebody who has a disability where they need to have a specific caloric intake, like POTS or diabetes, just to name two, they might acknowledge that this rule exists to prevent food mess in the space, so they eat the food that they need to consume as carefully as possible. My go-to disability survival kit snacks are ones that are not messy for this particular reason. And is that breaking a rule? For sure. Might I get caught in trouble? Potentially, but if I'm careful and subtle and quiet, probably not. And if I do get in trouble, I can just say, hey, I'm sorry, I got super dizzy, I had to take care of that. And they'd probably understand, if not directly ask if I'm okay. And even if they didn't, not the end of the world. It's totally fine. It's also important to take time to figure out what rules you feel are there that are getting in your way that are completely and totally arbitrary. I have a rule that I made in college that the first time I get up after I eat something, I have to put away the dishes. Otherwise the dishes will get forgotten about and not put away. That is a rule that exists for a reason and is super helpful, and it doesn't get in my way, and it's great, and I love that I have it. When I was growing up, we had a rule that the only thing we were allowed to eat between dinner and bedtime was a fruit or a vegetable to prevent us from not eating dinner and so that we could like have snacks later. It also encouraged me to eat fruit, which is really great and good and all that stuff. But as an adult, I realized I was still following this rule without realizing it, and I had to spend a lot of time training myself to not feel uncomfortable with eating snack foods at night if I wanted to eat a snack food at night. In that vein, I once saw a first-year college student cry of joy but also terror when she learned that she was allowed to have more than one brownie after a meal, and it's all good. We can work through that. It's fine. We can find the great snack on the other side. A lot of my habits now are a result of rules that existed when I was a kid that I no longer have to follow or are no longer logical, so sometimes I will clock that when one of those things gets in my way, and I will work to undo it. Another example of this is jaywalking. I think it's now legal in New York City, but I used to be super precise in waiting for every single light to change before I would go use the crosswalk, but now I know the patterns of the lights and the cars and how all of that works, and so I don't really follow that all too much anymore, unless I'm in like Times Square, obviously. I just go when it's clear. Rules are often made for, well, the jaywalking one actually is historically completely arbitrary, but more generally, rules are often made to be a general thing to structure a situation that may not apply to specific scenarios and actually need to be fluid and flexible. I would argue that a rule is actually only effective if it is more of a principle than it is a specific set of instructions, because that gives it the flexibility that it needs to be effective. When it comes to sitting in the discomfort of this kind of stuff, I also want to point out that guilt and shame are not the same thing. Guilt is, hey, I did this thing that didn't fit with my values and I feel weird about that. And shame is, hey, I'm a bad person because I did the things that either I think are wrong or have been told from the outside are wrong. Guilt is information that is important because it pushes us toward what our value set is and how we want to behave. Shame is not. And often unpacking shame can be a really important step in unlearning super strict rule following. Also, something that really helped me a lot with this was realizing that pleasing everybody is fundamentally impossible, and you're always going to make somebody upset somewhere, so you might as well do it in a way that preserves your own self-interest and well-being. Unless you're actively harming people, don't do that. Also, side note, I'm not really a self-help or pop science book person. They kind of make me stressed and self-conscious. Also, much of what finds its way into those books is super not empirically based. But I did recently read the book Daring Greatly by Brene Brown at the request of a friend, which is fairly research-based and about shame and vulnerability and whatnot, and I got a lot from it in this realm. So if you're looking for more resources in that vein on vulnerability and bravery and confidence and shame, I would highly recommend it. She had a really nice balance of analytical thinking and feelings-based thinking that I quite liked, so do with that information what you will. One personal example of unpacking shame for me is that I've always been told that video games in general are a waste of time, which I don't believe, but like when you hear a thing enough, it's kind of hard to ignore it. And also, even if they're not, phone games aren't real video games, and they're silly, and they're even more a waste of time. And I always felt really self-conscious playing them, so since like middle school, I only had Candy Crush on my phone, which I only play when I'm editing videos or watching things to review. And I recently realized that the shame that I felt around that was silly because games are super inconsequential, and also if something is fun, why does it matter whether it's wasting time or not? Not to mention that like they can teach lots of skills like patience and budgeting and delayed gratification and prioritization and whatnot, so they actually do help with a lot of distress tolerance. So I downloaded one about a month ago that my roommate and I call the silly Beep Boop restaurant game. I'm having a fantastic time. I'm feeling a lot less embarrassed or like I need to hide my phone when I'm playing a game on it when I'm around other people, and it's kind of like a small thing, but at the same time it's also kind of a big thing, you know? But also that's kind of half the situation, right? These are smaller conflicts and hard feelings we can learn to sit with and feel safer in and realize that it is okay when we know for sure beforehand that our actual safety is not in danger if we do those things. But there are also going to be moments where there are bigger conflicts and when maybe you actually do get in trouble, whether it's your teacher confronting you one-on-one or a friend or a boss or a police officer. These are things we also need to be able to manage. A lot of the tools from earlier do carry across here, like do what you feel fits your values and react authentically in the way that you feel in that given moment. You also don't need to give a long explanation or hand them every aspect of information you may know about a thing. You can give them the absolute bare minimum of information. With law enforcement specifically, you should definitely stick to as limited information as humanly possible because anything you say can be used to incriminate you. Also, don't offer to help any more than what they ask of you. Just do precisely what has been asked. In most conflict and confrontation situations, there is no real urgency unless somebody is actively dying, so just slow down, ask lots of questions, sit in awkward silences, take some deep breaths, get comfortable with the fact that somebody might be frustrated with you or annoyed with you, or they might dislike you or think that you're not smart. The tools of gray rocking can be super helpful here in like keeping what you say necessary, emotionless, and brief, engage as much as is needed in the situation and absolutely no more than that. And I used to find that in conflict I would get so nervous about somebody being potentially mad at me or not not seeing me as smart or not liking me that I would sort of word vomit as much explanation as possible as quickly as possible and hope that from that something would be the magic key that fixes the problem. But actually, doing the exact inverse of that is actually going to be a lot more helpful in situations, particularly in ones where maybe playing dumb is going to be the way to keep someone else safe or to keep you safe. Something this video isn't about civil disobedience or anything, it's just about self-advocacy, but also, hey, have you considered that in times of great need, playing dumb and continuously acting confused and asking for clarification and losing things and forgetting about things and being so slow with things that people just give up trying is actually kind of helpful in certain situations where that framework might be useful for no particular reason, of course. But I will say, when it came to hard conversations with the administration of my college years ago, keeping my cards close to my chest and simply focusing on being calm and clear and brief and what was needed and repeating that over and over again and how they can help make that happen, only giving the why if they ask for it, and keeping things as non-specific as possible was a much more effective tool and has been a much more effective tool in my work since then. Even if that feels unnatural, even if I worry that I leave a situation with them not fully understanding me or thinking that I'm difficult, it is a much higher hit rate of effectiveness than anything else. And also, you don't actually know what other people are thinking about you. You cannot put thoughts into other people's heads. And if you're really anxious all the time, you assume that everybody else is paying attention to you and thinking bad things about you, and that's probably not the case. Frankly, somebody in that room is probably admiring how you're behaving and how you're standing up for yourself and how you're standing up for other people. You really have no idea. So at the end of the day, learning to sit with big feelings in general is just a really important skill. Not moping in them, not letting them ruin your day, but acknowledging that you have a feeling, acknowledging where it may be coming from, deciding what you want to do about that, and then handling it and letting it move through you. And then, once you found your moral compass and values, applying and practicing that skill in ways to stand up for yourself and for what you want and need is even more important. This is a skill set that really is just a muscle that you need to work on constantly. A friend once said to me that smooth seas make garbage sailors. I found that sentiment to be quite helpful when it comes to dealing with lots of big feelings. You'll find that over time, some of the big things will feel less big and others will feel just as big, but you'll be able to say, hey, I have a toolbox on how to handle this, and you're gonna handle it like a professional, and it's gonna be super cool. And they're gonna feel really proud of yourself after, and that's really great. So, go forth into the universe. I hope that this was helpful to some degree. It did feel a bit rambly, but I seem to remember more life advice, lived experience videos tend to end up that way. I've not made one in some time, so if there's anything else you want me to talk about, please let me know in the comments. Also, please let us know what kinds of things you do or practice to get better at building distress tolerance in the comments below. We love having community resources. Also, if I might impart one more piece of life advice onto you today, I know the world feels like an overwhelming, flaming disaster at the moment. Please pace yourself. I cannot recommend setting social media time limits on your devices enough. You do not need to know all the information about everything all the time. Please focus on the things you can and need to control and how you can support your direct community, and only give what you have to give so that you still have enough energy to keep going so that you can give more in the future. Rest is resistance. Capitalism makes us feel like everything is urgent, and it is not. Even if you feel a little uncomfortable about resting because you've been told that rest means you are lazy or not trying hard enough, that is another big feeling to learn to sit with, and a particularly important one, in fact. And I'm gonna leave this one here. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember, critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.